Somebody, back when, a couple years ago, the term irregardless was put in Webster's dictionary. People freaked out because they're like, irregardless is not a word. And Webster's came out and they said, look, what defines the meaning of a word is how it's used. And that determines the definition. It can have different etymologies or whatever, but if people are using this word, then it means something, and we have to tell people what it means. And I think even evangelical is the new irregardless.
Yeah, and that's why I feel it's fine to call people bitch as well. Just, Okay, let's get started. Welcome to Beer Christianity. My name is Jonty.
I'm Drabs.
And we also have
Mario Russo.
Hey, Mario Russo. Mario Russo is our guest tonight on a special episode tonight. I mean, you're listening to a podcast, man. It's outside of time, like the Lord himself. Mario comes from a science background and talks a lot about science and apologetics and science and faith and all those sorts of things. So we'll be talking a little bit about that, as well as potentially a whole bunch of other stuff. So welcome to Beer Christianity. Also, if it's your first time listening, you can find all the other episodes at beerchristianity.libsyn.com. That's Libsyn, not SIN, because we're not that liberal yet. And yeah, that is the beginning of Beer Christianity. This is the episode. What are we, like episode 24, 25? I don't know. I have no idea. Anyway, Mario, welcome. And the most important thing we can ask you is what you're drinking right now.
I am drinking a delicious cup of tea. I believe
what?
I know.
What?
I know. I think it's Earl Grey. It could be English breakfast. I'm not sure.
This is genuinely a first for Beer Christianity. I'm not going to lie. This is countercultural. I'm loving it, quite frankly. Drabs, what are you drinking?
I got a Guinness tonight.
Nice. Excellent.
And what about yourself?
I got a Frontier. New World hops, Old World malt, premium lager. I don't know. It's a fullest thing. I freaking love Frontier. I've actually got 2 yellow lagers tonight, so that's good. But hey, Frontier people, if you ever want to spot me with some free beer for this podcast, you let me know, because I love this beer so much. Hoppy, malty, watery. I don't know what else goes into beer. Okay, so Mario, you have joined us to talk science. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the whole science and faith industrial complex. No, I don't know.
Yeah, so it was really interesting. It's a long story, but I started out in high school. I was fascinated with the Bible and with the Genesis story and creation story and stuff like that. And so I started out in fundamentalist circles where you had to believe in young earth creationism, literal Adam and Eve, 24-hour days of creation. And I started having conversations with people my age and older who believed in evolution, who were atheists. And I really desperately wanted to be able to give them answers for my faith. And so Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis, you might have heard of him. He's got a fantastic Australian accent, a very gifted public speaker too and communicator. He came to town and he did a seminar on young earth creationism, and it blew my mind. For the first time in my life, it gave me answers to the basic fundamental questions. How do we know God exists and things like that, and how to interpret the Bible. And so from there, it just kind of fed my need for answers. And I loved it. I devoured every book, every seminar every video I could get my hands on. And so from there, I became very passionate about Christian apologetics and about science. And I went on to university and I did an interdisciplinary Bachelor of Science degree in biology and psychology. And my goal was to teach high school students so that I could combat the lies of evolution. And I could send Darwin off into the sunset once and for all in the minds of my high school students. And then a crazy thing happened that I did not want to have happen. I went to seminary. That I did want to have happen. But what happened in seminary...
I was going to say, if you've been forced into seminary, blink twice, and we can try and help you out.
Well, it was what happened to me in seminary that I didn't want to happen. I started taking exegesis and hermeneutics courses, like how to read the Bible and how to interpret the Bible. And it caused me to re-examine my views, especially on Genesis and creation. And what I realized was I had taken a very hard stance on Genesis and on creationism as the only position. And I realized that there were other reasonable positions out there that needed to be considered. And I wasn't willing to consider them until I actually learned how to read the Bible sure enough, then I started changing my views on that. And so I slowly transitioned from the world of science and biology to more theology and trying to understand, okay, if this is what God actually did, as I've seen him do in biology, then I need to know more about this God and what he's done in terms of the realm of theology. And so that was a very interesting journey, but that was probably a 10, 12-year journey that took place, and that just a brief summary of everything that happened.
That's it was very similar to me. Well, not quite. I just remember coming up against a similar thing of thinking that the position that I'd been holding, that I assumed was just self-evident, and going to doing a philosophy postgrad and talking to my kind of course leader, tutor person, and her kind of pulling me up on the fact that I'd said, well, Christians believe X, and she's like, well, not all of them do, and then I'm like, well, then they're not real Christians, and her just looking at me like, what is wrong with you? And just that kind of position of defining who's in and out and making science a shibboleth. When you're in the apologetics and science kind of area, do you find that there's a lot of that on both sides of the argument? And do you think that's a particularly American thing, or do you think that's an evangelical thing?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely a distinctive of the American church, but probably even more of the Western church in general. And I would say probably the more conservative you get, the more hardline, the less willing you are to be willing to consider other views. There are people, I mean, we know for a fact that Richard Dawkins has written volumes on his view of science, and he's hardline, and he's not open-minded about considering any other position. But then we also have young earth creationists who take a very similar stance. But you also have young earth creationists who are very open-minded, and Ken Ham himself will say, if you're a Christian and you believe in evolution, of course you're still a Christian, and you go to heaven when you die. It's about Jesus, not about creation, but you're not a consistent Christian. So even he, to an extent, is willing to open up. But it can be really frustrating interacting on this topic, because people, especially Americans, I'm not so sure about the UK, but Americans are very defensive about these kinds of discussions. And I live currently in Germany, and in Germany, they kind of pride themselves on their openness, and we'll talk about anything. But if you have more than a 5-minute conversation and you start pressing them on things like the existence of God and things like that, and apologetic issues, you'll find very quickly that they have their opinions, and they may be open-minded to consider your perspective, but they're also very direct in telling you that you're an idiot for holding your position.
Germans having strong opinions on stuff. I'd not really, even considered that. That's weird.
Yeah. Well, somebody had to break it to you. So.
I'm intrigued by your comment that the more conservative you get, the more closed-minded you get. Do you find that true on the other end as well? Because I'm sure, I've encountered in particularly some academic kind of liberal circles that actually, if you were a young Earth creationist, they wouldn't even engage in the conversation. And there's a kind of looking down the nose academic thing that happens. Do you find a similar closed-mindedness at the other end of the spectrum, or is it not as pronounced?
Oh no, absolutely. It's absolutely as pronounced. It's almost as if you come full circle. Like if you have a circle, and at the top of the circle you have fundamentalism and conservatism, and then you kind of come down the circle and you come to the bottom of the circle. You're kind of in the middle. You're moderate. But then as you come back up the other side of the circle, you're kind of into the left and progressive, and then full blown liberal. But then you're right back at the top, and you find that.
You're still a douchebag.
There's so much douchebaggery, and I'm coming up against this again and again, guys. Where I'm seeing things about we shouldn't really even be talking about hope right now in a time when people are dying, and I'm just like, I totally get the thing of you don't want to look like a douchebag who worships certainty and who wants to have pat answers for everything, but we're so terrified of that on the kind of progressive side of things that we're now hostile to anybody who professes any kind of hope, any belief in God's sovereignty in any way is just, written off. The douchebag is strong. And I hate this because it just plays into that, maybe the truth is always in the middle. And I'm like, bullshit, the truth is always in the middle. There is a right and a wrong answer. It's just about the attitude you get with it, right?
Right, exactly. And that's one of the things I respect about Richard Dawkins. And yes, I respect Richard Dawkins. He's a, new atheist extremist, whatever you want to call him. I've heard a friend of mine describes him as an atheist jihadist. So yes, but I respect him because he even says that he hates relativism, postmodern relativism, just as much as conservative Christians do. He says, no, there is a right and a wrong. There is truth and lie, and there's black and white, and we have to recognize that. So absolutely, but that's not just in the field of theology. That's in the field of science as well. I used to be a volunteer at Answers in Genesis in Kentucky, a young earth creationist organization. And while I was there, I met a physicist who was a PhD candidate at a university in Colorado, secular public university. He was doing his PhD in astrophysics. He was coming up on his dissertation defense, and he was writing articles, but he was writing as a ghost author because they didn't want to publish his stuff under his name on the Answers in Genesis website, because they knew that if he came up for his dissertation defense, one of the questions that he would be asked is, what's your view on Genesis? And if he said, I'm a young earth creationist, he's an astrophysicist. He has to believe in billions of light years. But if he says, I believe the earth is 6,000 years old and the universe is, 6,000 years old, but with billions of light years, they wouldn't give him his PhD in astrophysics. They would deny him his degree, even though he's done the research and he's proven that he has earned the degree. So that's not just a liberal theology thing. That's in the sciences as well.
And I guess there's that scientism thing of assuming that all truth fits into the category of kind of positivist science, and how we have those sorts of proofs in order to, and that the only knowledge that we can be certain of, or the only knowledge that matters, is the knowledge that can fit into those kinds of things. My problem with Richard Dawkins is that he may be a good biologist. I have no idea, but he's a garbage philosopher. And secular philosophers would say the same, of like, please don't help us. Just stay in your lane, buddy. It's we also don't ask the cake decorators to do philosophy. Like, just because you're an academic in one area doesn't mean that you get to do it in another. So scientists, stay in your lane and let the philosophers do the grown-up work. That's just what I think.
I would add to that. I would say I wish somebody would tell the general public that as well, because the general public says, a theologian gets up and says, even for example, just a young earth creationist says, evolution isn't true, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh, you're a pastor. Oh, you're a theologian. You can't speak to science, da, 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 da. And then Richard Dawkins gets up and says, oh, there's no God. He doesn't exist. It's like, wait a minute. And everyone's like, oh, yay, see, Richard Dawkins says there's no God. See? Yeah. It's like, well, wait, what qualifies a scientist to speak philosophically if a pastor can't speak scientifically? And so there's this double standard. And that's something I don't think the general population realizes, that's a huge mistake they're making.
And also, a lot of the Dawkins kind of scientism, and again, my atheist and agnostic and humanist friends, a lot of them find him kind of embarrassing. He's kind of like the Westboro Baptist for them. And he's like, the question that they always have about this is just, it's an analysis of the kind of new atheism and that kind of aggressive atheism that came out a few years ago, and I think has actually passed out of fashion, to be honest. I was saying that it was a post 9/11 phenomenon, and this was a bunch of nice middle class, generally white, kind of well-to-do, educated people who really wanted to hate Muslims but didn't want to feel racist. And so if they could hate all religion, then hey, that just justifies all of that. And my favorite critique of Dawkins, and I don't particularly hate Dawkins, or I just think he's slightly arrogant to be trying to do philosophy. My favorite critique of him is not from your John Lennox or Alistair McGrath or any of those kind of apologist guys, but by Terry Eagleton, who was a literary theorist and a cultural critic, Marxist Catholic. And his whole thing is just about how unbelievably conservative that view is, and how right-wing it is actually, and how it plays into all of those kind of things, which I just really like, frankly, bringing that up with with people who like Richard Dawkins. But what changed you from, what was that moment that kind of switched on the light, or depending on your point of view, switched off the light of faith, to take you from young earth creationist to what your position is now?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, going to seminary and learning how to read the Bible exegetically, taking a passage, reading it in its historical context, asking the right questions. What did the author intend? What was he trying? What was his point? What is God trying to get done with this passage? Is he trying to communicate literal Adam and Eve, literal 24-hour days? to take that position is to take the view that God was looking 2,000 years, or in some cases more than that, 4,000 years into the future, to the 21st century or 28th century, and thinking about scientific questions related to Darwin's theory of natural selection and evolution, and trying to proactively, by several millennia, address those questions and concerns. And to me, that was one of the major turning points, was realizing that we were using a 4,000 to 2,000 year old document to answer questions that were relatively modern. And so I had to stop and go, wait a minute. So if those aren't the questions, if Genesis isn't addressing those questions, what is it addressing? And then it was at that point that I started asking other questions, like, what did the original author intend to communicate by saying it this way? And I didn't know this at the time. This would have been probably back in 2010, 2011, when I was in seminary. And what I realized now was happening then is I was having a subtle shift in my thinking, specifically my theological thinking, from answering the question of what is true. That is, when I read the Bible or when I think about a doctrine, I got to think, what is true? To shifting the question a little bit to what is possible? What is possible? It's not what is Genesis 1 actually saying. Is it 6 literal 24-hour days? Are Adam and Eve literal people? But rather, what is possible? It's possible that Adam and Eve were literal people, but it's also within the realm of orthodoxy to say that they were not. That's a possibility. And so when you learn to think differently like that, and you say, I don't want to know necessarily what is exactly true, but what is possible within the boundaries of orthodoxy, it completely opens up your world. It gets exciting. Science gets exciting. Theology gets exciting. Reading the Bible gets exciting. Because you don't have to try and figure out every minute detail of what is right or what is true. You get to discover what is possible. And that's the basis of science. That's the basis of theology. That's kind of the basis of all investigations. What's possible?
And it can be really beautiful as well, because like if you've watched Tree of Life, the Terrence Malick film that is basically God's response to Job, and it has that whole kind of really trippy, you're watching the movie and you're suddenly, what the fuck is happening? Because we've suddenly gone from like these cosmos pictures to like the evolutionary journey and stuff. But like it is exquisitely, magnificently beautiful kind of to contemplate creation at that level of complexity. So yeah, no, I totally get it. It is exciting. But Drabs, what's your position on this? Oh wait, do you have a question first?
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the the extent to that, because it feels like a lot of us are really happy to take early books in the Old Testament and say, actually, if we're asking, did this literally happen? We're asking the wrong question, but what did the author originally intend, and what's the meaning in it, and all the rest of it. But things get a little more cloudy when we get to the Deuteronomic history or we get into the New Testament, and because we can take those same arguments that we took to move from a young Earth position to a more nuanced kind of poetic interpretation of Genesis 1. But when we start talking about the Exodus or beyond that, when we talk about compare the scientific evidence for the kind of existence of Israel and the Deuteronomic history around them, or then we get into the New Testament and we start asking those questions. Well, is the virgin birth really an important kind of scientific thing, or is that just something the authors were trying to communicate in terms of this, Christ being the Messiah, or similarly with the kind of bodily resurrection, and how integral is that to our faith? And so, do you kind of, where are the limits of that conversation about? It's quite easy to say, if we're asking, did it happen? We're asking the wrong question, and let's find other possibilities. But there's limits to that, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Fortunately, most of the New Testament is just Pauline epistles or pastoral epistles anyway. So, trying to wrestle with the historicity of those documents is a little different than wrestling with the narrative. And so that kind of brings it down to the Gospels and Acts when it comes to narrative and stuff. So I do think the same questions apply. And the question you have to ask is, with Genesis, we have one account. Some people would say we have two, because Genesis 1 and 2 are two creation accounts. But my point is, there's one place where you can find the story of creation, excluding the Psalms and the poetic literature that describes creation. But we have four accounts in of the Gospels. And so the wonderful thing about that is we have comparative analysis. We can compare and look at it. And biblical scholars have done volumes and volumes and volumes of academic work comparing that. And so the questions we can ask are the same, but fortunately, because we have multiple accounts of Jesus's life, it almost bolsters the account for the historicity of Jesus, for example, is one of the questions, rather than diminishing it. And I know there's been a lot of scholarship in the last 40 years looking at, we've come such a long way from the 70s and 80s where it was like popular scholarship, if that's a term, maybe I can coin a new term, pop scholarship was, okay, guys, we know now Jesus never existed. He's basically a nice story that was made up. But he's a great teacher to follow. He said, the sayings that these people, these first century Jews came up with, really good teachings. They made up this character and we'll just go with it. We've moved from that, ironically, a very liberal, quote unquote, position to scholars, pop scholars at the forefront, people like Tom Wright, who have written groundbreaking, revolutionary books establishing the historicity of the resurrection. It's mind-blowing to think about. I don't know, some people would probably listening were like, what's this guy talking about? The historicity of the resurrection. He believes that Jesus really rose from the dead. I'm one of those crazy people who actually believe Jesus rose from the dead. But yeah, so it to me, it's interesting the direction that it's going. Typically we see things going from very, very conservative, very strict, very narrow-minded to opening up progressive, more liberal. And yet scholarship, as it particularly relates to the Gospels in the New Testament, it seems to be going, quote unquote, more conservative.
Ben, what's your view on literal Genesis?
So I guess unlike you guys who came from a more conservative or fundamental position, I probably never had that experience. Probably adopted my faith in my late teens and being a bit of a science guy anyway. I from day one was asking the kind of tough questions about things like Genesis account and that sort of thing, and so I've always understood it. I guess particularly Genesis 1. I think it's Rob Bell who talks about reading things literally versus reading things literately. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so understanding the literary form that these things are written in and seeing the kind of poetic way that Genesis 1 particularly is written. And there's some great stuff actually on your blog, your website there, Mario, which I was just saying earlier about that. Help me to understand what the author was trying to achieve with that, which was probably not cosmology.
Right.
Well, my favorite kind of thing that I heard about that was somebody explaining to me that Genesis is trying to tell you that as a kind of pre-modern people who are used to worshiping deities who need to be appeased because nature is terrifying and probably has some evil force that wants to kill you behind it, and it is all kind of imbued with these spirits. And I have some very nice pagan friends, and don't want to offend them and stuff like that, but for a pre-modern people, that can be quite a terrifying universe to inhabit. And this is setting itself up against it and saying, actually, this is a created order. It is separate from the creator, and it is good. It's made for you. It's made by a God who loves you, and it's okay. And that doesn't mean that you get to crap all over it or, destroy it or any of that sort of stuff. But it is a comforting thing to go, no, this is a narrative that tells you that God loves you and that creation is not to be feared. And I think that's amazing.
Right. And the creation account itself is a story about God as much as it is about the creation. There's so much for us to know and understand about the God who made us and made everything that comes from that. I would be inclined a little bit to agree with you, Ben, to think that I really appreciate the work of John Walton and his work in cosmology and ancient cosmogony stories and things like that. And I think he's brilliant. I think he's done an amazing job comparing ancient Near Eastern thought and cosmologies to Genesis. And I think there's something to it, but I don't know how much of that really relates. I mean, if you think about, depending on where you place Genesis being written, whether it was to Israel the Exodus with Israel coming out of Egypt or them in exile, is ancient Near East cosmology on the mind of Israel as they receive Genesis? I think that's a really important question to ask. I mean, whether you're okay, so you're slaves in Egypt and you're in the wilderness, or you're in exile waiting for redemption, and this document shows up, Genesis, and the first thing you're going to read about this God who's rescuing you, that you serve and worship, he's going to digress in a comparative analysis of cosmology. That, I don't know. I'm going to go with I don't know, because I'm on the record here, so I'm going to go with I don't know. I don't know.
In terms of a scientific reading of God and his intervention in the world, so coming from the place where you were to where you are now, probably not what you would call necessarily liberal, but definitely science friendly. How do you see God's breaking, bending, or ignoring of physical law in things like miracles? Because I've been reading Mark and looking at some of the miracles there, and it's kind of throughout the Gospels, or at least some of them, there's an emphasis on the miraculous. There is a really popular trend of thought to not say anything embarrassing in front of the non-Christians, amongst a lot of kind of Christian academics and leaders who will just go, well, you don't have to see it that way, and it was probably just I don't know. There's always the explaining away and an assumption that obviously what we know now in the 21st century about physical law could not possibly have been broken by Jesus, or God would not intervene to change that. So yeah, what's your views on that?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, they're not very mature or well-developed thoughts. But what I think comes to mind as we think about miracles and God's interaction with the world is, I think, first of all, if you're going to say, okay, what do you do with miracles? The question there assumes that God is active and present in and through creation. And I think that's the first place you got to start, is you have to at least acknowledge that God is actively at work in creation. And there's a goal, there's a point to which all of this is moving.
I mean, you say that you do have to. I mean, I've got to say that a lot of the Christian leaders who I encounter are functionally deists rather than actually anything that would believe in a God actually active in creation. But yeah. Okay. So say we start there.
Sure. And I understand. I mean, it's an understandable position to take, especially when you look around at the world. When you look at what's happening right now with COVID and the lockdown and everything, it's very easy to take that position. In fact, Richard Dawkins in one of his books says, if I had to, because he doesn't really necessarily argue against the God as a prime mover, as a first cause. He's arguing against, he's accounting for design, the apparent design in nature. And he says natural selection is the best explanation for that, not God. But even he says if he was pressed and he had to give an answer, he would say that at least a deist position is viable. It's tenable, not preferable, but it's okay. So that's certainly understandable given the state of the world and the way things are. It seems like and feels like God's not active and present here. Of course, it's really difficult to analyze that position because we have no what I would call counter data. That is to say, okay, but I believe God is active and present. So if we were to remove God from the world, let's see how bad it would really get. We don't have the ability to do that. So on one level, it's like, yeah, I can understand why it feels like that. And this isn't some type of new thought. This isn't some radical deism didn't come out of the Enlightenment. Has anybody ever read the Psalms? David is constantly aware of God's the feeling of lack of presence of God in the midst of suffering. So it's certainly an understandable position. But you do run into a lot of theological problems if God isn't present and active and moving in the creation. And I mean, obviously we don't have 4 hours to get into all of that, but for the sake of argument, assuming that God is active then in creation for consistency and continuity, God's actively at work in creation. So then, what do we do with miracles when we read about them in the Bible? Are they just exaggerations? Are they what do we do with them? I think the biggest thing is going back to the question of what are miracles there for? What's their purpose? Is it to just impress the reader, blow their minds? I think about Mark 4 and the story of Jesus calming the storm. And R.C. Sproul tells this story. He talks about it from the perspective of the holiness of God. But I think it still applies. He says, when there's a storm raging, they go and they wake up Jesus. He's sleeping in the back of the boat. And they wake him up and he says, don't you care if we drown? And, we're perishing. And Jesus just speaks to the storm and he says, calm, be still. And everything calms down. And I love what Sproul says. R.C. Sproul and I have many theological disagreements, many. But on this point, I think he nails it. He says, immediately the apostles all started slapping each other on the back, giving each other a high five and going, yeah, you go, Jesus. But that's what you would expect. You're like, whoa, wasn't that awesome? Look what Jesus just did. They freak out. They flip, they're terrified. Why? In Mark 4, are these guys terrified? This Jesus that they just said, don't you care if we drowned, gets up and calms the storm, and you think they would say, thank you, Jesus. It's obvious you care about us. They didn't do that. They flipped out. And the reason they did that was because they realized through the power of Jesus who he was. If this guy could speak to a storm and calm it, this guy must have authority and power over powerful natural forces. I think that's the point of miracles. If Jesus is the creator, if by him all things are created and through him all things are made, why would he not have the power to intervene in and with the natural laws that he established? If you accept that, then you have to ask, okay, well, why would he do that? I think part of the reason he would do that was to show who he was as the king of the world, who was going to die and become king and eventually make all things new and make all things right. He had to establish his authority over creation. And I think he did that through miracles. I think he showed the power of the kingdom. When it's at work in the world, then that's the kind of power that the kingdom has. That's the kind of power that Jesus has as the king over everything. I think that's the point of the miracles. It's not, you can come up with any reason you want for why miracles are in the Bible, but I think that's one of the main reasons, is it establishes the authority of Jesus. And that's why you read it over and over again in Matthew, where it says, and when he was done with the Sermon on the Mount, the disciples are like, it says the disciples were astonished because Jesus taught as one who had authority. And I think miracles go a long way with establishing that power of the kingdom and more specifically the power of the king of that kingdom.
Hey, I want to digress in that, but Ben, what do you think of that?
Makes perfect sense, and find very little there to disagree with. I guess my follow-up question would be: do they serve the same purpose today? And when we're at big revival events and see people get their legs extended to heal back problems, or get slain in the spirit, or whatever else, is that what's going on? That God is demonstrating His power for that same purpose? I
don't know that. I don't think we see the same kind of miracles today that we read about in the Bible. I think we, even in Acts, when you talk about the apostles, it seems to be that the miracles that the apostles did was to substantiate the power of the king, that to signify that the kingdom of God had come and was now at work. The inauguration of the new kingdom, as Tom Wright would say, had begun. And the miracles were the signs to point people to say, yes, the kingdom has come. Yes, God's work to renew all of creation is beginning now. And I think what you see historically throughout church history for 2,000 years is you see this slow, gradual decline until there just isn't miracles anymore. Do miracles still happen today? I would be inclined to say yes, but in the context, I would say, are miracles possible today? Yes. Do they happen in the context that you're talking about, where you have these tent revivals and all these things? I find them very difficult to believe, and I find them somewhat incredible in the old sense of the word. They're non-credible. There's been journalistic investigations done disproving a lot of faith healers and miracles that have been claimed. But I'm not personally aware, not to say that it isn't happening, because I don't know everything, but I'm not personally aware of miracles in plural where you can say, look, this is God at work and he's doing this movement in Sudan where all these people are being raised from the dead. We just don't see that. And I think there's good reason why we don't see that, because the miracles were given for a specific purpose that no longer exists. That purpose is not being served anymore.
Mm. That's interesting for me, because I find myself a bit of a contradiction here. Having said that I've always had very strong liberal leanings, I also kind of started off in a charismatic church. And so through personal experience of healings, fairly simple stuff, but stuff that I otherwise, it's one of those areas where my experiential reality just departs from my intellectual reality. So I find it really interesting.
Yeah, I was in a church where, not that long ago, actually a couple of years ago, where there was a guy who thought he had a gift of healing. And what that meant was he would pray for somebody and they would feel better or they go well. And I actually witnessed this one time. A good friend of mine in the church had sprained his ankle and he was on crutches. And he came to church that Sunday, and the bone in his ankle was pretty messed up. He was playing basketball, messed it up pretty bad. And the doctor said, the x-ray showed, definite damage, and he was probably going to have surgery. And the guy who thought he had a gift of healing came up to him and my friend and said, "Hey, can I just pray for you?" And he did. He put his hand on his ankle. He prayed for him. He went to the doctor 3 days later. The doctor said, "Everything looks fine. You don't need surgery. You're good." Was that a miracle?
Yes. What the hell is wrong with you? Of course that's a miracle. The hell do you need?
But is it the same kind of miracle where that the apostles had? Does it serve the same purpose of establishing that the kingdom has come to renew creation? I don't think so. I think in that case, the purposes are different. I think in that case, it's to demonstrate that God is active in creation, in renewing creation, that he's working in his church. His spirit is still alive and well, and he still loves and cares for his people. And so the purpose is different. So is it a miracle? Yes. But you can see that the purposes, I think it serves a different purpose.
I think this is the problem, is interpreting and seeing miracles in the Bible as only through the lens of that purpose. And the church that I got saved into definitely taught that as well. And I think we can all agree I'm probably smarter than Tom Wright, so it's fine for me to be taking an issue with him here.
I think it goes without saying.
Yeah, I think anyone who's listened to this podcast will know. But I think when I read the gospel accounts, I see Jesus having compassion on people again and again and again. In a literary sense, the purpose of their inclusion may be to demonstrate the ushering in of God's sovereignty over the world, of the kingdom coming into it, breaking forth into the world through him, with the ultimate, symbol being the resurrection. But I also see Jesus finding people in pain and desperation and distress and going, I want to take compassion on you. I want to help you. I want you to be less sad. I want you to suffer less. I see that. I see Jesus' heart in that. And I understand the consequence of that, because it is much less neat in an evangelical sense, where we want to tie everything up in a nice ribbon and a bow and make sure that our theology is systematic at all costs. So if that is the case, then why the hell didn't he heal my aunt when she had cancer?
Right.
All that kind of thing. And I understand that makes it messy theologically, but I'm not sure that means that it's not true. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think we could call what you're talking about kingdom pockets, where it's just like there's this pocket where heaven and earth overlap, and there's this something miraculous happens, and we experience the kingdom, and it's almost like there's just this moment that lasts for a couple of days where we're reminded again that God is still king. He's making all things new, and he's bringing everything to a final completion. And we get a taste of that through these experiences. But you're absolutely right 100%. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where we got to have these nice neat categories where either it's we've got to figure out what's true. Did miracles really happen? Do they still happen today? What are they for? I don't know. But I'm more interested in figuring out what's possible. Is it possible for God, who created everything, to occasionally intervene with natural laws, disrupt them, and do the opposite of what they were intended to do? Yes, that's possible. To what extent? I don't know. but let's just focus on what's possible and not necessarily on what is exactly right, the truth.
Yeah, and the people who are getting cocky with it and it's just the cockiness. I'm immediately like, I don't know. That's where I start doubting, as if they're super cocky. Whereas if they come in super humble, I'm like, well, maybe actually, I think that's probably all right. Okay, in terms of science, you know when you inject disinfectant to prevent COVID-19. I don't want to be harsh to the American on the podcast. You're our guest.
I'm just glad you didn't say we were going to be talking about politics today.
Yeah, no, of course not. No, that had never happened. But in terms of people, let's let them remain nameless, who would say that, is there a crisis in America in its attitude to science, and is that related to Christianity in some of its expressions? Because it looks like it is to me, and it's kind of academic and culture wars when you're talking about evolution, slightly less when your president is taken seriously and is not, let's be honest, this isn't his fault. This is expressing a general anti-intellectual, anti-science trend and kind of stream of culture in the States. And yeah, do you recognize that thing that I'm trying to, that picture I'm trying to paint there? And do you have any thoughts?
Yes, unfortunately. I do. I think there's actually two extremes. It's really interesting because I don't know if you know anything about the United States in terms of where different states are positioned or culture, between the difference between northern and southern culture in the United States. So I'm originally from New York, but I've lived in South Carolina. I lived there for 23 years. Live in Germany now, but my sister also lived in South Carolina with me for 23 years. But she lives in Maryland now, which is in the north, way up north. It's really fascinating. So yes, whenever you use the term American, the first thing that always comes to my mind is which America? The West Coast, East Coast, South, North, because it's almost like 5 different countries, you include the Midwest in there. So yes, I would say mostly in the southeast part of the United States, running from the East Coast through Texas and through even, I think, a lot of the Midwest. There is this almost anti-intellectual intellectualism. The less I know, the more I know. And we have this saying, I don't want to offend any Southerners. A lot of my friends are Southerners. And so if you're listening, I'm not trying to be offensive. I promise.
Some of my best friends are Southerners. they're lovely. You know, they've got great rhythm. Yeah, but there's this saying that they have, and that is, I don't know about all that. And so you're like, Genesis is not to be taken literally because we know in the Hebrew that this and John Walton wrote this book and then blah, 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 blah. What do you think? And they're like, well, I don't know about all that. But I just know that the Bible says blah, blah, blah. And it's this, I'm right because I don't know anything kind of attitude. And it's, and I don't know how to describe it, but yes, it's this anti-intellectual, science is wrong. I mean, we have people using COVID-19 as an argument against vaccines. COVID-19 is literally what you get when you don't have vaccines. So yes, people are there is definitely this mindset of if it comes from a scientist, if it comes from a doctor, it's automatically wrong. Or any expert, because that's an elitist kind of, yeah.
Exactly. So there is definitely that. And it's in theology, it's in science. This
is what we ask for when we become Protestants and we go, we don't want a hierarchical authority. We don't anybody, it's just us, yes. We don't need any experts to teach us anything. Well, then this is what you get, Protestants. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but then on the other end, there's also this idolatry of it's the idol of intellectualism education. My sister, who lives in Maryland, she describes the exact opposite of culture, where she goes out into the grocery store and she'll strike up a conversation with the cashier or whatnot, or another customer. And she has a newborn baby, so they'll come over and they're like, "Oh, your baby's so cute," And she's like, yeah. And so they'll start talking and then they'll ask her, so what does your husband do? And she's like, well, my husband's a pastor. And they will literally stop the conversation, turn around and walk away. Just boom, we're done. And this mindset of how can you be so ignorant and so backwards as to be religious? Like Hello, science has completely disproven the need for religion. What are you living in, the 19th century? Get a grip, like Google something. That's kind of their attitude. Like, hello, there's Google. We have Wikipedia now. We know we don't need religion. So that attitude of, I'm so much more intelligent than you are. I'm so much more well-informed than you are. There's that other end of the spectrum. So it's crazy to me, but that's the attitude. Is it's either, well, I don't know all about all that, or you are literally the dumbest person I've ever spoken to. I'm done talking to you now. And so there's both. There's definitely both of that.
Yeah.
I'm curious, your experience in South Carolina, is that, so a bit of background, when Jonty told us that we were getting a Southern Baptist apologist on the show, I was like, wow, he is in for a rough night.
Hey, what I said was my friend who introduced us said he's a Southern Baptist, but he's one of the good ones. That's what she said.
Okay, so
one of the good ones.
He's the good one. No,
yeah. So I check out your website before the show starts to think like, okay, let's find out what's going on here. And I was like, oh, it's actually all quite reasonable. And I think my comment to Jonty before we started was, it feels like he's trying to drag those Southern Baptists a little bit more towards the kind of left. Is that how you see part of your ministry?
Yes, but don't
probably
tell
not in those words.
It
Russell,
is. Don't
Russell Moore will be okay, but he'll also deny it, right? That's the deal.
But this has to stay our secret. Okay, you can't tell anybody this.
Cool. Don't worry. Anybody listening to this, do not tell the SBC.
I'm going to be in so much trouble. So yeah, I think when you're referring, I just want to be clear. When you're referring to my website, are you talking about biologos.org?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I need to be really clear. It's not my website. This was biologos.org, and you can go there and you can just put in the search bar Mario Russo, and it'll pull up all the stuff I've written.
Yeah, but we reckon you're the best thing on it. It's basically it's Mario's house now, bitches.
It was founded by the director of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins, who, if you don't recognize him from there, you'll probably recognize him from the Human Genome Project. So, one of those Southerners who, doesn't know about all that. Clearly a massive intellectual mind. He started it actually as a way to help reconcile this idea that there's conflict between science and faith, and how we can show the harmony between the two. So, but I write for them. I'm a contributor for BioLogos, and several of my articles are there. You can check them out. That's biologos.org. There, I did my plug. I'm good.
Okay, biologos.org. And if they want to search for you, what do they search for?
You can just search for Mario Russo. That's MARIORUSSO, and it'll pull up my, I guess, like an author page, and it'll have all my articles there that I've contributed for.
Awesome.
So I think I mean it's always been to actually answer your question. I don't know if I want to drag the SBC left. I think what I want to do, if I can put it in slightly more politically correct terms.
You don't think that they would love that? Weird.
Why would that be a problem? Why is that be a problem? I think the best way to put it is I want to show not just people in the SBC, Southern Baptists, but I want to show anyone who has ideas about what is true. I want to show them how it's so much better and more wonderful and thrilling to think about answering the question, what is possible? And I want them to consider, I used to be that kid who loved to read, really, really straightforward, black and white. It is this is the truth. You have to believe this kind of articles. And it gets exhausting after a while. It really kind of, it gets exhausting after a while. And your world starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller, because you're always there's always this competition, between, well, you believe that it was 6 literal days, but I believe that you believe that the earth was created 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, but I believe it was created 6,000 years ago. And you're just constantly trying to contrast yourself with somebody else. And eventually your walls just kind of start closing in and getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And I just want to help break down those walls and say, guys, there's so much freedom we have in Christ. There is so much freedom. Let's enjoy that freedom that we have. Let's explore that freedom that we have, and not to weaken our faith, not to abandon our faith, not to give us license to sin, but to give us the freedom to enjoy Jesus more. You know, we're Southern Baptists, so we don't have to worry about the Westminster Confession. But you know, the first thing in the Westminster Confession is what's the chief end of man? To glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. And I want to get us to enjoy God a little bit more.
And what about those people who find more enjoyment in the simplicity of the black and white, and the people who actually find the freedom exhausting?
Screw those guys.
I wouldn't say that. They're okay. That's okay.
They are okay.
Because they fit within the realm of possibility. They fit within the realm of possibility, right? It's possible to say that this is the true thing to believe, and that's okay. And I don't want to consider any other position. Okay, that's fine. You don't have to. But let's at least make it available to other people who are interested in seeing what else is possible. Let's not make decisions for other people. Because if someone had made a decision for me and said, no, you can't explore other interpretations of Genesis, you can only believe this, that's dangerous. That's really dangerous.
Yeah.
Theologically, it's dangerous, certainly scientifically, but it's very dangerous to be in a church or to be in a community where you're told this is what you have to believe and you cannot believe anything beyond this. That's dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big hurdles for a lot of people who are either kind of Christians who are just wondering whether they should be embarrassed about being Christians, or people who are considering the Christian faith, is this thought that, well, yeah, but you have to basically abandon science and anything that science has taught us over the last, millennium, if you want to believe in this weird kind of archaic and arcane religion. So, I love websites like BioLogos just for the fact that they demonstrate that there are a lot of really quite senior scientists who do believe in faith. They do believe in God. They do believe many of them are Christians. I mean, anything to say about that to somebody who's thinking like, yeah, but I mean, is it literally just pastors who like reading about science, or are there any serious scientists out there who believe in God?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. If it depends on who you ask. If you ask, or I should say, it depends on which search result in Google you click on. It will give you a different answer. The general impression, I think, in society is that 99% of scientists are atheists. The other 1% are young Earth creationists who got their science degrees from Christian universities. So that's the general idea within society. That's just not true. I think I was just looking at this. There was a Pew Research poll done, I think it was in 2012. So it's a little old, but it might be a little newer than that. That showed that, I think it was, depending on how you interpret the data, as much as 51% of scientists are religious and or believe in a God, whether that's the Judeo-Christian God or a higher power, spiritual life force. They believe in something. That doesn't mean that the other 49% are atheist. What that means is that the other, I think it's, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think it's like another 30% are somewhat agnostic or don't know, haven't committed to any religious position. So it's not like they're anti-religious. They're not on the new atheist side where they're just out there ready to just write a book to disprove religion. It's that they either don't care, it's irrelevant, religion's irrelevant to them, or they don't know, and they haven't figured out where their views on religion are, or they believe that they can't know, that there's, whether or not a God exists, whether or not religion is good, that those are questions that we really can't answer. And so they just kind of focus on the scientific questions. And then I think it's less than 20%, well, it would have to be by that math, are actually self-professing atheists. But then you could even break down the numbers further and look at those that are scientists that are self-professing atheists. They are not all Richard Dawkins. They're not all Sam Harris. A lot of those scientists are the ones who are really angry at Richard Dawkins because he kind of portrays science as this end-all be-all, as in an almost quasi-religious sense. And they're kind of upset that he gives atheism a bad name. So even within, let's be generous and say 15 to 20% of scientists who are atheists, There are people who disagree with Richard Dawkins and his views. So no, it's, and again, you've got Francis Collins, who's the head of the Human Genome Project, head of the NIH, deeply religious, deeply in love with Jesus, who's had significant impact in the field of science. I think you're going to have a hard time reconciling how someone can, with such deep convictions, Christian convictions and religious faith, can have such an impact on science if science and faith are so irreconcilable.
Nice. Recommended reading from either of you in terms of science and faith, particularly. Mario,
no, you go first, Mario.
You go first. This is your house.
Well, you said either of you, and I just finised talking. I didn't want to interrupt
that. Such a nice guy.
I know. I try. I'm Southern Baptist. I have to. Yeah, I think it depends on where you're coming from. There's lots of great general books. If you want to get started on, I recommend 2 books right off the bat. If you're looking like, okay, science and faith really interests me, I want to know more, but I have no idea where to begin. Like, I just want an introductory book to kind of give me an overview of what in the world everybody's talking about. What is this all about? I would recommend Alistair McGrath's book, Science and Faith, a New Introduction. That will give you an introduction to the main issues that are being talked about. It'll give you an introduction to the important figures in the science and faith discussion, including the new atheists, but also other scientists, philosophers, and also some important figures from the past. If you're more kind of a history guy and you want to kind of also dive into the history, well, wait a minute, hasn't science and faith like always been at war since like the Greek philosophers? Hasn't like science and religion constantly been at war? And then whatever happened with Galileo, wasn't he like murdered by the Catholic Church for being a scientist? And which he wasn't, by the way, just setting the record straight. How do I read more about that? What actually happened? There's a great book. It's a Science and Religion, a historical introduction, and it's edited by Gary Ferngren, and it is a wonderful book. It can be a bit technical in some places and academic-ish, but it's really well written by leading scholars, and they do a wonderful job explaining, very fair, very balanced. They take a very moderate, middle-of-the-road position. Jonty, I know you don't like moderate, middle-of-the-road positions.
Absolutely not. Also, you just said fair and balanced, and I know there's a TV station that
well,
you can take the guy out of South Carolina.
We don't get Fox News in Germany, so... Yes. So those are the 2 books I would recommend off the bat.
Those are good recommendations.
Francis Collins' book, The Language of God, it details his journey as a scientist into faith and how he became a Christian and the impact that's had on his life as well.
Ben, you got any?
Just one, actually, slightly different tack, but we had a bit of a conversation this evening about the way we understand, interpret Scripture, and how that affects our understanding of the science and the faith side. And one of the most influential books for me, and interesting, has been a book called The Meaning of Jesus. And that was co-written between N.T. Wright, Tom Wright taking the conservative position and Marcus Borg taking the liberal position, and each of them addressing different kind of interpretation issues in the New Testament, things like the virgin birth or the resurrection or the crucifixion, and taking different approaches to Scripture and arguing them. And they each do a kind of chapter on an issue, and you kind of get to the end of one and like you're wholeheartedly bought in, then you get to the end of the other, organized in the opposite, and you're wholeheartedly bought into that. It's quite nice. They alternate who goes first and who goes second. So
Brian McLaren and Tony Campolo had a book like that as well, about
did they really?
Adventures in Missing the Point, which is it's really cool. Yeah. It's really cool. Really nice. For me, I think basically kind of articles by John Polkinghorne and talks by John Polkinghorne have been really interesting. He did a talk at Greenbelt once. So he's a physicist. He did a talk at Greenbelt about the resurrection and about what that would look like, the resurrection of all people when Jesus comes again, and the kind of renewal of creation, and how much of that would be continuity and how much of it would be different, and how matter would need to change so that you no longer had entropy and decay, which is just fascinating. It was just so freaking cool. And of course he did it in a kind of hour-long talk and stuff. But that is very awesome. And then in terms of the more kind of new atheist stuff, I just love Terry Eagleton, and he did a set of talks at Yale University called the Terry Lectures, not named after him actually, the Maria, where he talked about this stuff, and it came out in a book which I'll just grab from my shelf. Reason, Faith, and Revolution, I think is how they collected it. But just very, very cool. And Eagleton is hilarious and kind of bitchy in that intellectual way, which I really like. So I would recommend those things. Mario, a final word to our listeners about faith and reason, if you wanted to leave them with any one thought.
Yeah, I would say science and faith are far better at constructing reality together than they are apart. And so for those who are more scientifically minded and come from that perspective and don't have a lot of experience with theology, I would say get into theology and see how, when paired with science, it makes the best sense of reality. And for Christians who are really into theology and don't really have a grasp on science, or science deniers, first of all, embrace science. Second of all, really explore how scientific knowledge adds to your own faith and together with your theology and your faith in Christ, makes the best sense of reality. Because when you take those two things and you bring them together and you look at the world, you don't just get a better picture of the world, you get a better picture of its creator. And it is seeing Jesus through the lens of science and faith is and can be, and probably, I think we'll say, not possibly, it definitely is the most beautiful picture of Jesus you can have.
That's awesome. Mario, thank you so much for talking to us today. Remember to check out Mario's articles on biologos.com.org. biologos.org. Do check out our previous episodes as well. Our last one was on singleness, which is really kind of awesome. Before that, we spoke to somebody from Extinction Rebellion, one of the Christians who is active in that in the UK, and we got loads of other lovely stuff. So do check us out at beerchristianity.libsyn.com. Do check out more of Mario's stuff, and you can write to us at beerchristianity@yahoo.com. You can also get in touch, beerxianity on Twitter, etc., and all the major podcasting platforms. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again soon.